All right, so Joshua, there's obviously a ton of data that you all have just released into the public, the results of your legal trends report. I'm sure we'll talk about that in a moment. Tell me, when you look at the legal space, specifically in relation to technology and the usage, what are the biggest ways that you're seeing firms leverage technology now that's creating additional productivity on their end?
That's a great question. And so one of the things that we take a look at as a part of our annual key performance indicators that we look at is utilization rate. And so for those firms that are billing hourly, how much of a day are they able to devote and record hourly work on? And what we see is that there's a generally positive trend for firms that are increasing their utilization rate. It's currently at 37%. So just a little over a third of their day is being spent on billable work.
I think the last year was, what was it, 34%?
Yeah, around that, yeah. So we've seen year over year increases, which is great. But there's still just a vast amount of most lawyers day to day that's not being spent on billable work. In 2020, we actually published what we internally call the good to great study, where we took a look at 3 different cohorts of law firms over a 5-year period in Clio. Ones that were growing, they were the top 20%. Ones that were just kind of status quo, and they were the middle. And then there was the bottom 20%, which we saw tended to have declining metrics. When we looked at the growing law firms, while they had like huge increases in revenue, over 150% increase in revenue, what we saw driving that was a very small increase in utilization rate. They went from 27% on average to 33%. So that small amount of just spending your day being a lawyer, doing billable activities, actually really increases the productivity of the law firm and the revenue of that law firm. It's not the only way that lawyers can be productive, but it's one of the clearest metrics in the legal trends report.
Sure. And in the work that we do with our clients, we're constantly pushing this theme of increasing the utilization of the attorneys. Obviously, the more attorneys are focusing on tasks that actually create billable work, that actually create revenue on the back end, and it creates a more profitable firm at the end of the day. So for the folks who don't understand or haven't seen the legal trends report, or maybe are not familiar with it, what's the work that goes into this report? How do you aggregate the data and ultimately create this really well put together report that shows the status of the legal profession?
So the legal trends report is unique because it actually relies upon the anonymized aggregated data of tens of thousands of law firms. And they're contributing this data by using Clio. So we can't look at case files, we can't look at client communications, but we can see how lawyers are setting up their Clio accounts and certain high-level metrics of how they're using their Clio accounts.
Sure.
One of the examples I give is, again, for hourly billing, lawyers set a billable hourly rate. And I can't tell you what any one firm is charging, but I can see a bell curve of the hourly rates that have been entered in Clio and tell you what the average is. So the current average is $340 per hour per lawyer. And so it's that anonymized aggregate data that makes up the bulk of Clio's legal trends report. We do find that it often raises more questions than answers, and so we supplement that with additional research. That could be surveys to lawyers and other legal professionals, could be surveys to clients, both potential and past. This year, we actually looked at a trove of anonymized historical financial data that had been gathered by a partner around law firm spending, and that was very interesting. And we've even started using AI analysis and classification of certain types of anonymized data that we host internally at Clio.
Okay, so this really starts to paint an accurate picture of what's going on in the legal space in general.
Yeah, it's the first time we're looking at how lawyers practice, not how they're telling us they practice, if that makes sense.
Now, are you finding that typically those are different, the answers to those questions are different in reality?
Vastly, yeah.
Really?
When we first published that utilization KPI that we were talking about before, what we found is that most lawyers weren't even billing 2 hours a day. But when lawyers were surveyed, they were telling us that they were billing, 6 to 8 hours a day.
Sure.
Now, most of those lawyers were in big law firms because those are the lawyers who have time and accessibility to answer surveys, but they were also, I think, telling the surveyors what they thought the surveyor wanted to hear. And so it's a type of bias that you often see in these surveys.
Sure.
So being able to take a look at what lawyers are saying versus what like tens of thousands of lawyers are actually doing, we can start to see a difference between the two.
And I think those numbers start to show themselves. We're on the practical application side of these things, so typically when we work with our clients, we'll often reference the Clio Legal Trends Report just to start to build some conversation around how the firm may be performing currently.
Yeah.
And they're always shocked when we unveil the metric around utilization in particular. You know, last year, 34% was the average utilization rate in law firms across the United States. And they always tell us specifically, it usually comes from the managing partners, they're in disbelief.
Yeah.
There's no way we would not be able to operate if we were only billing 2.7 hours of our day. But when we start gathering data behind how the firm's functioning, we find that tends to be right in line with exactly what the data shows.
And that's not to say those employees and those lawyers aren't working hard. They are. But are they doing the right work?
Sure.
And that's one of the questions that's raised by that metric in the Legal Trends Report.
Sure.
Yeah.
And what I find as well is that when you look specifically at utilization, since we're talking about this particular metric, there are so many ways that an attorney can be more efficient with their day so that they spend a higher proportion of that time on client-facing work.
Yeah.
And just creating the avenue for that conversation to take place, I think, is really important because the data shows that the time is not being allocated in a way that's in alignment with what the attorneys
the best use of their skills, the best attention to the client's actual needs, right? As well as the needs of the law firm. You can balance both, but what we find is a lot of lawyers lean one way or the other, and that can lead to a skewed service model and really make it hard to have a sustainable law firm, which is bad for clients there too.
It's often difficult to put together a realistic picture of how the firm's performing, especially if you're interviewing and surveying internal employees.
Yeah.
Specifically when it comes to utilization. If associates are supposed to be billing a certain number of hours a year and creating a certain level of efficiency with each day that they clock in and clock out, it's really hard to get accurate data from those folks who ultimately know that these metrics, if they don't work out in their
they could
favor,
be fired or they might not get their bonus or something. Yeah, and so that might lead to them putting 0.7 rather than 0.6, right? And so it's difficult to see that self-reported data. But once you get into the scale of Clio's big data, we start to get a lot more certainty of what's really happening.
Yes, and I love that because that's one of the things I'm constantly reinforcing when, specifically in those scenarios where the lawyers are shell-shocked by what the metrics actually are, you can't argue with the data. And you guys have sourced such a large data pool that you're incorporating into these reports. The averages work out that way because they're mathematical averages. So that's always fascinating. So I want to transition a little bit to a conversation around AI.
Okay.
Specifically used and how it's being used in the legal profession. Yesterday I spoke and it was all about how law firms can be strategic about implementing AI in a purposeful way.
Yes.
Rather than just simply looking to adopt AI technology to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak. So, with that being said, what are the opportunities that you're seeing for lawyers and law firms from 2024 and beyond, specifically relating to AI? And what are you seeing from your vantage point? Yeah,
I think AI has so many use cases, it's really hard to pinpoint just one. When we look at those KPIs that we mentioned before, like utilization rate, what we see is there tends to be administrative work, business development, handling, the simple things like your day-to-day to-do list. And then there's also the billable work. And we're seeing AI opportunities in both sides of that, right? And so lawyers are telling us that they trust AI to help them generate marketing materials, and it's speeding that up for them. But we also see that lawyers are using legal drafting tools, contract tools that use AI. And so there's no single component of the business of law or the practice of law where you can't be creative and use these tools. The question is, just like you said, are you doing it strategically and towards a goal that's for the best of you, your firm, and your clients?
Sure.
Yeah.
Now, so let me ask you this.
Yeah.
The overall sentiment around AI adoption, I was staggered by the results that you all just outputted yesterday.
4 out of 5 lawyers are telling us they have adopted AI, at least
crazy.
Partially. Yeah.
And when you look even a year ago, that percentage was so much lower.
It was 1 out of 5.
Yeah. Yeah.
It really was, 1 out of 5.
And what was the statistic around the firms that thought that AI would be in their roadmap over the next 12 months?
What we saw is that I think it was 86% of lawyers surveyed said that there would be greater adoption of AI in the legal space in the future, and that included 68% of lawyers who aren't using it right now.
Sure.
They're just saying this is coming, it's inevitable.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what are you seeing opportunities for growth with AI specifically? One of the things that is a common occurrence when we're implementing AI platforms for our clients is that there's this perception that by leveraging AI, the billables for the firm will be impacted in a negative way.
Okay.
So what are you seeing? I mean, obviously that's a threat, but can firms use that in order to turn that into an opportunity?
I absolutely think that they can, and a large chunk of our analysis this year was trying to quantify just what is at risk for billable revenue when it comes to adopting AI. And what we did was we took a look at anonymized aggregate time entries, right? And then classified them against a work activity system called ONET, or Occupational Information Network. And by looking at over 7 million time entries and bringing them together to these highly specific classification system tasks, we were then able to see how much of each of those is potentially automatable.
Sure.
What we found for lawyers is that 57% of time entries were automatable by AI, depending upon how they were classified in the system. So certain things like preparing legal documents rolls up into producing documents, which is the generic work activity task in ONET. And 80% of that is potentially automatable. And so that's 80% of the hours gone from drafting a document. And anybody who has asked ChatGPT to draft anything will be amazed by the speed of it. Not necessarily the accuracy, right? And I think that's that remaining 20% that's not automatable, but it gets the first draft done.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so what we were able to quantify is that 66% of time entries that we reviewed fall into 3 buckets of generic work activities: documenting, recording information, getting information, and analyzing information. And lawyers who are doing that, it's 57% of their billables fall into those types of categories. And for the average lawyer, they're looking at close to $27,000 in hourly billed revenue that could be subject to automation and therefore vanish.
Sure.
Yeah.
So firms have to be looking at this data, wondering how do we create a competitive edge for ourselves?
Yeah.
Specifically when you're talking about AI, what we found is that, and we don't have a legal trends report, which is why we rely so heavily on you all to produce a report, but I can tell you anecdotally with my clients, they're looking for ways to increase their efficiency, but not at the cost of revenue.
Yeah.
Now, when we started to survey and ask about the type of time entries that are ultimately billed to clients, and then as a result of that written off, what we found is that a high percentage of their activities that they were creating and to move their legal matters forward were being written off specifically for types of tasks that are a good fit for an AI platform.
Okay, so they're already editing their bills down because they're like, no client's going to pay me for that.
Or clients are specifically requesting to have bills written down, right?
Yeah.
So now you run into a scenario, one of our clients, we created a discovery resolution letter request AI tool for them.
Oh.
Right, so what this tool does is it allows them to take the entire content of the discussions and correspondence between their client. They can take that, input it into this tool, and it will generate a complete timeline of all the discovery items that requested, complete with interrogatories.
Yeah.
Now, this particular component, what they found is that, I'm referencing a specific firm that we're working with, a family law firm.
Yeah.
What they found is that they were writing off a large majority of the time that they were spending on those types of activities. So when we implemented the AI to solve for this component, it actually, on paper, it looked like it would affect the billables because technically that was billable time.
Yeah.
But it actually ultimately did not.
But then because of all the write-offs, they didn't lose anything. They actually gained time back that they could be spending on billable work.
Right, because what it did is it brought them to a very proficient level very quickly so that they could spend the remaining time perfecting and creating that A-level work. And I think that's the biggest opportunity there